This is the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 38, talking about Aurelia, or hopefully I pronounced that right. And today on the panel we have Danny Blue.
Hey, everybody.
Nick Niemeyer.
Good morning.
And our new co-host, Tyler McGinnis.
What's up, everyone?
And our guest today is Rob Eisenberg. You might know him on Twitter as the Eisenberg Effect, or on Gitter, or GitHub, and tons of places. So why don't you introduce yourself?
All right. Well, yeah, that's me. My name is Rob Eisenberg, and I am, I guess, a software developer for a while now, since I was a little kid. And I do a lot of work on front-end framework design. And so you may have used Caliburn or Caliburn Micro on Windows. You may have used some of my Unity data binding stuff. You may have used Durandal on the web, or you may have heard of Aurelia, which we announced just a couple of months back. But I love front-end engineering. I love trying to make it elegant, trying to make it easy for developers to build complex apps and enjoy their work. And so that's kind of what I'm known for and spend my time doing.
That's awesome. How little kid is little kid?
8 years old, I guess.
That's pretty cool.
I started programming when I was 8. Yeah.
They didn't have any My First Programming books at that point.
No, they didn't. That was in the 80s, and I had a Commodore 64, so I just there wasn't a lot of materials at the time. I started learning Commodore Basic, and then I heard about this thing called C that the big boys used, and so I started teaching myself that a couple years later, and just kind of went from there. It was fun, man. Those were really fun times.
Awesome. So, do you think it's now? I know I'm not following the topic sheet at all. So, do you think it's easy? Do you think it was easier back when you started, or do you think it's easier now to get into programming?
Oh, it's much easier to get into programming, that's for sure. I mean, with the web, the resources are fantastic. I mean, just all the learning materials, just the ability to just, ask the web a question and get an answer. Before, I mean, when I was a kid, it was sort of like you went to the public library and there were like maybe, if you were lucky, 2 or 3 books, there. And so I checked out every book, and read it, and that was it. In the bookstores at the time, they had some books too. But it wasn't like, you can go into a bookstore today and there's a huge selection, of every imaginable topic, or you can go on Amazon.com and find anything. So it's definitely much, much easier today. And of course with the web, it's, everybody has a free open platform, for building just about anything on every single device they owned. So, I mean, I remember when I was a kid too, and I got into C, I like saved up my money and I spent like $500 for like Borland C++ builder, I don't remember what it was, but it was like the student edition, It was like my mom had a friend that was going to college, and she got me like the student pricing, and this was like that's what you did,
It's compared to now. That's such a high barrier to entry.
Yeah, it was.
Where you can just.
I'm sure there were kind of some open source compilers and things back then too, but I didn't really know. There was no internet, and I was just a kid, just like kind of feeling my way through like library books and things, just trying to figure things out. So I didn't have access to people that were programmers, that did it for a living or anything like that. So it's very different today. You can throw a rock and hit a programmer, and you could just go search on the internet and find whatever you need. So I think it's fantastic. I wish I had the resources of today back then. I see.
Yeah, I actually had the opposite, where my father was an engineer and he dabbled in programming as I was growing up, and we had an Apple II and we had built our own PCs. But I was like, "You're too smart for me. I don't want to do this." And I didn't get into it until like my late 20s.
Yeah. That's fun.
So you've been building for a long time. You've been doing frameworks mostly for a lot of your recent career.
Yeah, about 10 years. So that's I didn't start doing professional development really until the early 2000s. So my dual loves were computers and music. So I actually studied music at university. I was a music composition and theory major, but I was kind of so I kind of put down programming for a little while I was doing that, and then picked it back up afterwards when I needed to pay my bills. Uh, but I've
Yes.
been doing framework design for about 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly the reason that we brought you on. So we already mentioned Aurelia, which is your newest project. Tell us what it is. Tell us what Aurelia is.
Yeah, so it is basically an app building platform, built on top of the web. It's hyper focused on standards, on the future of web technologies like ECMAScript 6 and 7. Um, it's very focused on what I would call user experience for the developer. So, there's kind of a pushback against any kind of lots of configuration or boilerplate code. The idea is to let you write very clean code, to not see the framework a lot, so very little framework intrusion. Focusing on you just kind of, to the extent that we can make it possible, we want you to write plain JavaScript. We want you to use, modern JavaScript. And it's all built around just sort of best practices in terms of, I hate to use that buzzword, but really it's kind of my 10 years of experience building front-end frameworks. I kind of take everything that I've learned and I kind of push it forward every time I have the opportunity to build for a new platform. And so it really kind of encodes that experience into the framework in terms of how you separate concerns, how you do modularity, how you handle kinds of common patterns and problems that you come across when you start to build larger applications on the client side. So if you will, it kind of encodes that experience into the framework, but tries to do it in such a way that you don't, that it's a pleasant development experience, that you're not configuring the heck out of it, that you're not writing just a bunch of stupid code just to kind of make a framework happy, if that makes sense. So it's very focused on user experience, the user being the developer. So having a pleasant time, enjoying your job, getting your job done, writing clean code, being able to write code rapidly and produce very quickly, but not sacrifice having a solid architecture at the same time. So a lot of times when you want to work real fast and be super productive, you sacrifice testability or you sacrifice modularity. But Aurelia wants to make it easy for you to not have to make those sacrifices, but to still be highly productive and have very clean code. So it's kind of all about all those kinds of things. And I think if you kind of compare it to what else is out there, you'll see that it quite excels in that area of just being very clean, simple, easy to understand code.
You've done Durandal. Many people may or may not know that you're the author of that library, and you worked with the Angular team, working on some of Angular 2, like Watchtower.js and some other pieces of that. So why not just expand Durandal to be like Durandal, Ultra or some new crazy name? Why rebrand?
Well, it is sort of like a spiritual successor to Durandal, if you will. People that have used Durandal will find it very comfortable, and the migration path is very, very smooth. It's not that there isn't work there, but there's very little for a Durandal user to have to learn. It's a very natural flow. However, it was a complete rewrite. There were significant changes in terms of how it was put together, constructed, architected, all these kinds of things. And it felt also that there was enough changes in that way to sort of warrant a new name. And also, it was, frankly, from a versioning standpoint, a bit awkward to, to say call it Durandal 3.0 when we're actually still working on Durandal. And we might release a 3.0 of Durandal just to keep enhancing that, So we get into these weird versioning issues, and versioning is really important to me, following semantic versioning. So we kind of wanted to say, well, this is a 1.0 product. And we wanted to kind of deal with the versions that way, and we wanted people to know that there was a connection to Durandal, but we also wanted people to know that we're targeting the future web. It's kind of, we're reimagining things. So I kind of felt that warranted a rebranding.
For sure. So at work, I deal a lot with junior developers. So I work at like a learn to code boot camp type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the benefits of Angular, or even React now, is that there's so much community behind it. There's so many learning resources. As a beginner, it's nice to jump into that because you have so many resources available. So what would you tell a beginner who wanted to get into Aurelia, and kind of where would they start?
Right. So first, important to note is that Angular's been around since 2009, and React's been around since, I don't know, maybe 2012, 2013.
Sure.
So they've had years to kind of build that up. And Aurelia, we just literally announced it maybe 2 months ago, a little bit over 2 months ago. So, and we're in an alpha stage. But if you want to jump in, we've got docs on the website. I can tell you that there's a Pluralsight course in the works. I can tell you that a major publisher is, we're working a deal for a book with a major publisher. I can tell you that we're working on some rather significant docs, that we're also working on, various video tutorial series, building sample apps. So we're going to have a bunch of really nice kind of samples that teach things. Those are all, a bunch of those things are in process because, like I said, nobody even knew this thing existed till a couple months ago. So for the absolute beginner at this point, it may not be the best thing to jump into because, like I said, it is alpha 2. That said, we have seen a bunch of people jumping in who have no experience with single-page apps whatsoever, and they've been very, very happy because the learning curve is actually much smoother. In general, what we're finding is that the most difficult thing for people to learn is actually not Aurelia, but ECMAScript 6, because we're totally based on ECMAScript 6, and so we bring these new constructs, from future JavaScript today. So people are having to learn, like, okay, how does standards-based modules work in ES6? How do classes work in ES6? And once they actually learn that, Aurelia has been pretty easy for them. So. We do have a really good community. Again, given that we just announced this a couple of months ago, we've got a very active Gitter channel now with approaching, I think, 900 people in there. They're talking all the time, and it's people of all levels. People who, are framework builders. The core team is in there. Usually, someone from the core team is in there. Every hour of the day, someone's in there. And then people that are very, very beginners, sometimes even they're coming from, actually not having really any JavaScript experience, but coming from, like, for example, I built frameworks for Windows, so they might be looking to migrate. There's people in there looking to migrate off of, like, native platforms into the web, and so they're in there having not even looked at JavaScript in years, And it's a different beast, but so there's a wide variety of people, and we've seen really good response. The community growth has been fantastic, and we have a lot of plans that's really around the learning portion. Like I said, there'll be Pluralsight stuff pretty soon. There'll be a book probably. We'll have our own materials on the website are going to be very greatly enhanced. We'll have our own video series, and there'll be other things as well. I don't want to. Some things are kind of in the planning and on the down low.
So one way to make things easier to learn is also in line with one of the goals you stated earlier, which is keep it kind of a low-touch framework, so you don't have to rewrite all your code to be Aurelia code like you would like the common path would be in Angular.
Right. Exactly.
So how do you sort of achieve those goals? How do you not make it so that everyone writes Aurelia code?
Yeah, so a key component of that is actually conventions. It's figuring out what is a reasonable set of conventions. You don't want too many, and they can't be too complicated because then you introduce another learning problem. So they have to be a relatively small and simple set of conventions that can get a lot of that you can get a lot of mileage out of. And so that's one of the ways that Aurelia does it. So we use some naming conventions. This is naming in terms of export names, which are not a problem for like minification because it's part of your public API service surface layer. So we can use naming conventions. Because we've got a module system, we use kind of module path conventions. So let me give you a couple concrete examples. You want to create a custom element that is like an expander or something. You click on it, it expands. You click on it, it contracts. So imagine you want to encapsulate this into a reusable custom element. Well, what you would do is you would create a JavaScript file called expander.js, and in there you'd write an ES6 class, and you would name it, expander custom element, and then you would write an HTML file, and you'd call it expander.html, and you'd put your HTML in there. And the framework understands that if you have something exported from a module that is named, custom element, then it knows that it plugs into the HTML compiler as a custom element. So it knows how to treat that. It also knows that because you have expander.js, that by default there's a view that's going to be expander.html. So you don't have to explicitly tell it that. So it goes and it looks that up, and it data binds them and all that kind of stuff. So it's a simple convention. In fact, it's even simpler than that. You don't have to name it custom element, because by default, if your module has a single export, we just assume that it's a custom element. So you can just name it. You have a class named expander. It doesn't actually matter what the name is at that point. Well, the export name we use to generate the HTML tag name if you don't specify it. So you just follow. That's basically like the only convention right there. This basic module pattern of what we call view model and view, which are the same name but with different extensions. And then some naming conventions for different things that plug into the compiler. So there's custom elements, there's custom attributes, there's things we call value converters that plug into the binding system. And so these are the simple conventions. Now, all of these can be explicitly stated. So if you just don't like conventions, then you can actually not rely on conventions at all. You can explicitly state these. And for that, pending the release that I've got to get out today, for that we're actually preferring the use of decorators, which is a new feature coming in ECMAScript 7 or ES 2016, however you like to call it these days. And so Babel, the Babel transpiler just released that last week, and the TypeScript 1.5 alpha just went out, I think, either last week or the week before, with support for decorators. So our release coming out today has full support for decorators. So this is where you would interact with the framework, because you would have to import these decorators from the framework, and then you would decorate your classes with them. But it's still kind of it's not using a proprietary like configuration API or a proprietary, it's still pretty minimal code, and it's very easy to see that and separate it out. So you still just see the decorators. It's using standard ES7 decorator syntax, and that's how you would manually configure things if you didn't want to use the conventions. But the simple conventions get you very far for a lot of your application code.
I was going to ask you about that, actually, because I saw on your GitHub you have, like, for the last month, you have like 1 billion commits to all different parts of the Aurelia ecosystem. And then you have a couple of commits to the specs for decorators and annotations.
Right.
So that's kind of good to hear that you guys are going to be doing that.
Yeah, I've been in touch with the TypeScript team since I think like May of last year. When I was working with Angular, I kind of connected them with the TypeScript team because they had AdScript at the time, and I said, guys, there's this thing called TypeScript. It's really similar to what you're doing. Why don't you just use that? Now, it took them about a year to do that, but that's where that story started. And I had already had a relationship. I have a number of contacts at Microsoft, so I kept that relationship up. And when TypeScript started looking at adding some of those features, I got connected also with Yehuda Katz, who works on Ember, who is spearheading the ES7 decorators, and he and I and Jonathan Turner from TypeScript sort of colluded together on decorators, and then the TypeScript team got involved, and they did really fantastic work on like formalizing the spec. And then Yehuda kind of took the salient parts related to just pure ES7, extracted that out for his for the ECMA meeting that was, I don't know, it was a couple weeks ago maybe or something like this. And that's how that sort of happened. And then basically that kind of got sold back to Angular. And they got more involved at that point too. So there's a lot of frameworks that are kind of now involved with these specs. There's kind of two. There's decorators, which is the pure syntactical aspect of ES7 that allows you to decorate classes and members basically with a decorator that is essentially a function that can transform whatever it's decorating. It is literally the decorator pattern. If you've studied design patterns, it's literally kind of an implementation of the decorator pattern at the language level. It's very cool, very powerful. One of the things that you can do with that is add metadata to things, because a decorator can just alter a class or member in any way. So you could just tag things with information. And so there's actually, you could do that without it needing any kind of standard to do that. Just using plain JavaScript, you can have the decorator that just does that. But we'll also have another spec that's being worked on, which is a metadata spec for ES7 as well, which would give a standard reflection API for basically storing metadata with, with classes, members, initializers, all different aspects of JavaScript classes and other constructs in JavaScript. So then there would be a standard way to read and write metadata as well. So that's a separate spec that's going on. And on GitHub, that work is actually being done now, which is really cool because anyone can kind of check it out and like read the stuff and participate in the conversations. And so that's kind of being done. And what's great is that there's a lot of people involved. Ember, Angular, Aurelia, TypeScript, the Babel guys are there. And so it's kind of like the framework authors and compiler people are all kind of trying to work together to bring this down and then bring it to ECMA. And there's a lot of interesting possibilities that open up. But our release today is using the new decorators spec, so you can use them in TypeScript and with Babel. And we've kind of reworked how we do our metadata via decorators. And we do some other things with decorators too, but it makes a very nice JavaScript, again, it's standards-based JavaScript way of kind of doing this, and it makes your code very clean and just adds to the elegance, I think, of building things, which is really important to me. I like very clean, readable code. When things can be declarative, it's really nice, and decorators are a declarative way of doing things that you would have had to do imperatively before. So it makes things much more readable when you're looking at a class. And it makes it a very nice way for frameworks to publish these decorators for consumption by developers building things that they can pack a lot of power into a decorator, and it's just a simple, decorate my class with this kind of a thing. So that's real cool stuff, and a lot of work, collaboration going on in that I'm happy about.
That's awesome. One thing I did notice was that you talked about the Gitter, and I went on there several times last week. I have to say, that's like the best chat room on Gitter I've been on. It's so active. You have like core members on all the time. People are asking questions left and right. I don't think I've got an empty icon on my notifications for it since I started looking at it.
Yeah, it's very active. I'm really happy about that. Really happy. Yeah.
I posted in there, that you were going to be on the show, and I asked people if they had questions, so maybe at the end, after we learn a little bit more, we could go through those.
Sounds good. That sounds great.
Again, off topic, can we just pause for 1 second to acknowledge how good Babel is?
Oh yeah, man, I can tell you, it's phenomenal, and that's another one with a very active Gitter channel, just constant releases, it's very important to them, to the spec compliance, which and clean code generation too, of course. Those are kind of things that drew me to it, but just phenomenal work being done there, and that really is a key enabler for something like Aurelia. I mean, without it, it would be a much less pleasant experience. So I'm really happy with them, and we're going to look to doing what we can to support them and draw attention to them and help them continue to do the work they're doing.
Yeah, looking through the code, it is very lean, as we said, and it's modular, but there are a lot of specific, like Aurelia router, Aurelia logging. Is this like extensions of the framework, or are they components? How does this all work? Can you swap in your own logger instead of that?
Yeah, so the logger, the logger is an interesting case because that's primarily designed to be used internally by Aurelia to give the framework a common way to push information out to the developer. You can use it yourself if it works for you. It is designed to be extensible, or you can just drop your own logging library in, but that's primarily, that's a specific case where we have a very lightweight kind of logging implementation that really exists there primarily so that the framework can tell you things about what you're doing. When you have convention-based systems, it's really important to have insight into what's going on. So if you do something wrong, the framework needs to be able to tell you. If you configure something wrong or don't configure something, we need to have a consistent way of telling you. So that's kind of what that's about. Something like the router is a place where you would interact with the framework. I haven't really thought of a good way to kind of abstract. I don't know that I want to extract that away, but so the router is a place where you would bring in an Aurelia library, explicitly import it, and configure it. But this is going to be at kind of isolated points in your app, and this is the sort of thing that you would certainly have to change if you were going to any other framework. So I don't feel too bad about that. One thing we do with the router is try and make the route configuration pretty simple. So you configure the router with like a plain JavaScript object. It's as opposed to it being a bunch of APIs that you call on the router to configure it. There's basically one map API that you provide just a JavaScript object to that kind of has a known structure. And so that makes it a little bit simpler too, because it means that you can kind of construct that object any way that you want. You can even bring it down from the server. Some people do interesting dynamic things where they have, based on the user, they will actually have the server send down a specific route configuration just as JSON data, and they'll pass that JSON data straight to the router. So even though that's an example of where we can't really be convention-based, we can still favor an API that allows a lot of flexibility and power to the developers, and where it's not having to learn a ton of API calls, just a basic simple object structure that's plain JSON that we try and find intuitive names for,
the most fun part of programming anything, thinking up names for things.
Right. Right.
So you've mentioned several times, quite a few times, that you are trying to stay true to spec for ES6 stuff, for ES7 stuff.
Yeah.
What about Aurelia custom elements and components? Are those based on the web component spec?
So this is a fantastic question, and it has a multifaceted answer. So first, because I don't know if all the listeners know, but when we talk about web components, it's really multiple specs. So there's HTML template element. Yeah, four of them. So there's HTML template element, there's shadow DOM, there's HTML imports, and then there's custom element. And Aurelia uses most of these. So let me kind of tell you what we do. So first of all, if you look at an Aurelia view, every Aurelia view is inside of a template tag. And this is the HTML template element spec. So we use that piece for our views. It's implemented in every browser except for IE, so we polyfill it for IE. It's not that huge of a deal. It's a little bit wonky, but you don't need to know that as a developer.
Do you have your own polyfills, or do you use Web Components JS?
So for HTML template element, we have our own for the moment because at the time that polyfill was not broken out inside of Web Components JS. I think that they may have changed that. I definitely created an issue for that, but we haven't switched over to them. Now for the other ones that we do use, we rely on Web Components JS. So let me get around to the other things. So template element we use for our views. We load our views with HTML imports. So you don't interact with any of those APIs per se unless you're doing some HTML imports inside of your view. But we load the actual process of loading the view is done through HTML import technology by default. Now it is abstracted away in our case, so you can actually turn that off if you don't want that and plug in something else. But by default we use HTML imports to do the view loading, and one of the reasons that's nice is because we wanted to have a good story for integrating with something like Polymer or anyone else that was using web components who wanted to package their web components as HTML imports. We wanted, so our view loading by default is done with HTML imports in order to make that seamless experience when using other web components, basically. So we use that. I have a number of issues with HTML imports. We could talk about that in a minute. But we are using that right now by default. Another thing that we have is support for Shadow DOM. So Shadow DOM we don't use by default, but this is a place where you would override a convention. So if you wanted to use Shadow DOM, you would actually use a decorator on your custom element that says use Shadow DOM. And then we automatically would render your view into the Shadow DOM. Now we have a fallback, so it doesn't really matter whether you can still use content selectors even without Shadow DOM. Even when you don't specify Shadow DOM, and then we have the same fallback if you do specify Shadow DOM, but you're running on a browser that doesn't support it, right? So we kind of make that use case work, but we don't render into the Shadow DOM by default. We kind of make you ask for that, and one of the reasons is performance reasons. Also, we don't want people to overuse the Shadow DOM. I think that there might be people get excited about things like that, and they shove things in the Shadow DOM that really shouldn't be there. Like you've seen the situation where like someone puts their entire app inside of Shadow DOM, and this is clearly not what should be done. And frankly, because no one's really aware of all the performance implications of building a large-scale app that uses lots of Shadow DOM. We just don't know that. It may be fine, but we just don't know yet. I don't think the community as a whole really knows that yet. So we enable it if you want it, and then we have different fallbacks, and we just kind of make it work. Now the piece that we do not use right now is custom elements. We are planning either for V1 or post V1, shortly after post V1, the ability to wrap an Aurelia HTML element as a web component and then use it as a web component outside of an Aurelia app. But the implementation of our custom elements when used from inside of Aurelia do not use document.register element.
Okay.
Okay, so does that make sense? So we actually built that into the compiler because it actually made things a lot better for certain scenarios. But we are strongly considering perhaps an optional plugin to Aurelia called like Aurelia Web Components that you could include to basically take the Aurelia HTML element and put a little bit of infrastructure around it so that it works as a standard web component. Now, so why did we not just do that, you might ask? And this is a really good question. Yeah, so one of the problems, there's two things that are related, HTML imports and custom elements. And one of the problems with HTML imports is that I strongly believe that it really shouldn't exist the way it does at all, to be frank. It should use the ES6 loader. There's been tons and tons of work that has gone into ECMAScript 6 modules and module loading and the design of the module loader, the pluggability of it. It's extremely flexible. You can do just about anything you want with it. It's a kind of a consistent API, really. Speaking in terms of ES6, the ES6 loader is basically designed to be a general-purpose resource loader. So you can load JavaScript, you can load images, you can load JSON, CSS. You can do all kinds of things with that.
And scoped, too, which is something that imports is not.
Yes, and so this also comes to custom elements as well. I have a real problem outside of the scope of a smallish application. I think you get into problems with custom elements as they are today because what you're doing is you're introducing global scope again. You can't. Every custom element you create is a global basically, and so there's been so much work done on ECMAScript 6 modules in order to get away from this problem of globals that we've had in JavaScript since the beginning, to introduce the loader, to introduce realms, which are part of the loader, to have this import syntax, and so that when you're writing in your JavaScript module, you can know what's there and what's not there, and kind of have a bit real encapsulation and real certainty about what's happening in there. And custom elements as they're designed right now, they kind of reintroduce this problem again. And so this causes problems of naming conflicts. This causes problems with just potentially not being able to rely on what's in the DOM. I haven't looked in what the plugin stories, but I can at least imagine a story where someone's got a Chrome plugin that defines a custom element, and then maybe you're running your app and there can be conflicts, or maybe there is a a real popular custom element out there for doing Markdown or something like that, and some plugin on the page uses it, but then your app also uses it, but use different versions, right? And then which one registered first, and then all of a sudden your app is breaking, and it's because something else on the page registered this same custom element before you did, and or maybe it's, it's just like there's
We
problems.
can totally relate.
There's problems with that. So to get around these problems, what Aurelia does is it introduces its own sort of importing mechanism for views. And we actually called this import at first, but we renamed it because people thought it was HTML imports and it was confusing. So there's actually a custom element in Aurelia called require. And anytime you want to use a custom element in an Aurelia view, you require it in. Require, and then you say from, and you give it the relative module path. So we actually try and mirror the ES6 syntax. So you can actually use from and as on this element. So you use from just like you would import from in ES6. You say require from in HTML, and you give it the module path. And we actually pipe that through the ES6 loader. So we're trying to solve both of these problems at the same time. So what happens is we have a resource processing pipeline that's built on top of the ES6 loader that then goes and gets that module and uses our conventions and things like that to figure out what this thing is that you're actually importing. If you've used conventions or if you've decorated things. We figure out, oh, this thing you imported is a custom element. Okay. Then it needs to be registered locally in this view as a custom element that can be used inside of this view. And so the resource pipeline does that. It uses the ES6 loader, and and here's where it gets interesting too. If that custom element has a view, we use HTML imports to load that view, but that's actually done through the ES6 loader. So we actually have a plugin to the ES6 loader that uses HTML imports, and what this does is unify the pipeline for us so that we have a singular module resolution behavior for module IDs. So that means any kind of map, path, shim config that you've done through the ES6 loader will also apply to your views. So we get all the correct pathing resolution that comes through the ES6 loader, but the actual active loading is done through HTML imports at that point. But this is all seamlessly integrated. As a developer, all you do is say, I require this module in my view, and then you get that custom element there. We also let you globalize things because we do realize that for a number of apps you might have a core set of widgets that you just use everywhere, and this requiring of things everywhere can maybe be a little bit tedious. So we do have a way that you can globalize these things as well that uses the same pipeline to do that. And another thing is that like I said, we mirror modules. So in the same way that in ES6 you can do import, foo as bar from X, right? You can also add an as attribute onto this require element as well, and so you can rename custom elements as you're importing them into the view. So if you happen to have two custom elements you're using and there's a name conflict, or just the names are too similar maybe and you might be confusing, you can rename them as part of the import process, and then you use it as that renamed version inside of the view. So again, we're trying to actually so this is not standards. This is like not standards based, but it's built on top of standards. But we're trying to borrow from the significantly good ideas that have been developed in ES6 and think about what they would look like inside of a view. So that's why we kind of borrow this modular concept from ES6, and we bring these concepts over, and that actually solves a lot of problems because then again, in your Aurelia view, you can know, these are the custom elements that are here. Here's the path to the module. You can rename it if you have conflicts, and you can be very certain about what behavior is in any given view in your app. And I think I would love to see some of those kind of ideas come back into the specs because I think that these are real problems as you get into real application development. You hit these problems. So hopefully that gives some explanation of what we're using and kind of why and how we've kind of layered some things.
Yeah, and we've talked to some of the people at Firefox groups and like Mozilla, and they kind of agree with you. Some of the developers there, as far as the imports go, and it would be nice though to have a declarative way to have HTML come in. Not just having to load it through JavaScript. So if that could get changed so that it was, scoped to a fragment or to a shadow boundary or something. That might be something down the road for standards that might be useful.
Yeah, I think that would be highly important. I haven't really tried to figure out. I would like to blog about some of this more, but I would like to kind of also think about what a standards-based API might look like for that, which is why I haven't really blogged a lot about it yet. But I think as the web moves more towards being a rich application platform, I mean, building native-like apps, all the problems and all the solutions that have happened sort of in the native app world are things that we can learn from and should learn from in terms of modularity and isolation. And this is kind of one of those things that I feel, as the specs currently stand, we've got these different ways of loading things. We've got this global state, and I feel that we know that these are not ideal. And so I feel that we should go ahead and fix those things before we lock it all down if we can, and get everybody using them, because there are going to be problems, and I think we're going to kick ourselves.
Yeah, custom elements is changing so fast, and now the polyfills have shady DOM and shadow DOM, so it's a lot.
Yeah, well, shadow DOM is another. We could go on shadow DOM too.
That's a whole other episode.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
something is needed. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it is. It's terribly complicated, and I feel really uncomfortable introducing something that complicated into HTML, which has been historically pretty straightforward. But we can go and there's other issues. We could talk again sometime.
Yeah, no, anybody that listens knows that most of us here are really like web components and all that kind of stuff, but there is just some really kludgy stuff in there right now that's still getting worked out.
I think the idea of web components is fantastic. I mean, everybody wants this. Everybody wants this, but the specs as they are currently have some issues, and I think they need to be ironed out before we get ourselves dig a hole for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, all the browser vendors are getting together now, and they're looking through the shadow DOM contentious bits that Dmitry Gleskov wrote.
Right.
And they're trying to come to a consensus, so I think we'll have some breaking changes and things will work out.
And we'll leverage as much of it as we can in Aurelia. Like I said, we're already leveraging 3 out of 4, and we kind of have a plan to leverage the 4th as a sort of an add-on if you want to use Aurelia as a, so to go back to that original question, Aurelia, I really think of it as an application framework. But you could use it as a component framework, as a secondary use case. That's what we would enable as this new feature with custom elements, to say like, well, I'm not really going to build an app, but I want to build this awesome calendar widget, and I want to use Aurelia because I like its data binding. I like whatever, just the way you put things together. So I want to go ahead and create this component with it. And by plugging in this extra piece, I can now export that component as a W3C web component, and somebody can use it in an Ember app, right? So that is not like our primary use case right now. We're very much focused around application scenarios, but we also want to be focused on just as a platform for building just components independent of applications. So that's a secondary story we want to address as we move forward, and as some of these things are kind of worked out, and we see how that goes too.
Awesome. No, that's a more than thorough answer. I appreciate that.
Yeah, sorry, I can be long-winded, so just cut me off.
No, that's perfect. That's what I wanted. So so I got it. I had one other question about the way, still kind of tied the way that Aurelia renders its views and things like that, where a lot of frameworks now are following in the path of React and Famous with virtual DOM type things. Mm-hmm. So I know Angular 2 I actually think is leveraging Famous in some aspects. I think I heard that at some point. And Ember 2.0 is using has a new rendering engine which does some things similar to the way that React handles stuff. So
Glimmer.
Yeah. Their Glimmer engine.
Yep.
So does Aurelia have plans to implement some sort of shadow DOM, some sort of virtual DOM? Too many DOMs. Some sort of virtual DOM implementation, or do you think that letting the DOM handle it, it's the native DOM handle it, is going to be the way you guys are going to move forward?
Yeah, so a quick correction on Angular. I'm not sure the entire details. They're probably working with Famous to have them integrate, but I don't think it's part of the. I don't think it's baked into Angular, but they do have
Okay.
a render
Yeah.
layer that they recently started refactoring to an explicit render layer. I'm not sure all the details of that because that happened after that's only happened in the last month or so.
Okay.
Now, in terms of the way Aurelia works, right now, I'm nervous to extract the DOM away too far,
Okay.
because I've worked on other platforms, server-side platforms. So my background is in .NET in terms of server-side technologies, and back in the beginning of .NET, we had web forms. And what web forms did is it tried to make. Hope I'm not going to get like in some kind of flame war here. What it tried to do is it tried to make web development look like Windows desktop development. You guys have locked up. Are we still together?
There we go. I think we're back.
Okay.
We good? Okay, yeah. We had a moment. Everyone panicked. People started throwing things, but I think we're good now.
I think it's because I said web forms. Did you hear that part?
Yes, we did.
Yeah. So back in the beginning of .NET, they had web forms, from a marketing perspective, it was a smart move because Microsoft wanted to kind of capture the VB6 developers and bring them into the web, and so they made this API that looked like desktop application development, but it was web development. But it so far extracted the true nature of web development that it basically became a monster. And then some years later, they decided to create an MVC framework that was much closer to the way the HTTP works. And all of a sudden, things got really simple again, and people got power back that they needed, and this sort of thing. And so I kind of have that experience in my history, and it makes me really hesitant to build a framework that abstracts away the true nature of the thing that it's built on too far. So I'm hesitant to use a virtual DOM. Now I think virtual DOM is a super smart idea. I'm really impressed from a computer science perspective of what they've been able to do. But right now the way Aurelia is built is we work straight against the DOM. Now we don't do this we're not naive about how we do this. So one of the things around performance is that if you because a lot of this has to do with performance, right? That's really what everybody's getting at. So can we achieve the same performance without a virtual DOM, or even be faster, or anything like this? So one of the things about performance is that if you go touching the DOM a lot and messing with things, and you don't do it all at the same time, this causes serious performance issues. So a lot of the problems that Angular 1 got into performance-wise were around dirty checking, and then they had some of these issues where where things weren't batched, and a lot of the earlier frameworks had these kinds of issues. The way Aurelia takes this on is that most changes happen through the data binding system, and everything that happens to the data binding system happens in a batch. So we use something called the microtask queue, and this is something not as many people are familiar with. But it was invented kind of to make DOM mutation observers and promises and object observe much more performant. And so the normal task queue is something that you would put work on with like a set timeout. And when you do this, of course, there's a full browser turn that happens, and if you schedule more work from inside of normal task, another full browser turn happens, and so you get this issue of potentially work being spread across multiple frames, and if you're messing with the DOM in there, then you're messing with it across multiple frames, and you're causing additional renders and layouts, and it's a problem, real problem. It'll kill performance real fast. It'll kill anything like you're trying to get 60 frames per second animation. You can pretty much forget that. So one of the things we leverage is this thing called a microtask queue, which executes after every user event, basically. So if you have a click handler and you mess with some stuff, it'll execute right after that. And any work that is queued to the microtask queue while running inside of the microtask queue gets queued into the same queue. and that queue gets drained by the browser. So the effect of this is that it's much easier with an asynchronous binding system to now do completely batched updates to the DOM. And this doesn't even matter if one thing in the binding system changes or triggers another thing in the binding system and triggers another thing in the data binding system, because those triggers are all happening in the same macro task queue, and they're getting queued up into the same queue, so they all get processed as part of the same batch. So this is a huge, huge boon for performance, because by leveraging this, you can basically get automatic DOM batching in the most efficient way possible, using a technique that was designed for object observe and promises to make them faster. So this is kind of a core concept of the way that Aurelia's binding system works. If you've got object observe, we use that. If you don't, we kind of polyfill it using getters and setters, but that publishes it on the microtask queue, so you get the same timing model, the same batching model, whether you've got it natively or not. And everything's kind of built around that, so you get a much more efficient way of actually working with the DOM. And so we're relying on a bunch of these techniques. We don't do dirty checking. A lot of performance problems people had with Angular 1 was because it had to dirty check things, but we use an observable model, so we know exactly what changed, when, and we can minimally update the DOM. You know, if you change one property that's bound to the href on an A tag, then that gets queued to the microtask queue, and then we change the property, we change the href, and that's all we do, right? So we do very, very minimal work, which is very unlike a lot of previous systems. And we do the batching also, which is very unlike a lot of previous systems. So for example, using Knockout. Knockout is an observable-based system, but it doesn't do DOM batching, because when you change the observer, it's sort of strongly connected to the thing, and it goes change to the DOM right then, right? It doesn't get queued up and batched or anything like that. But our system works differently. Like everything is the binding system asynchronous, so that it can all be batched as soon as possible together, and that's a huge difference. So we think that this is going to be at least as performant as what people are doing with virtual DOMs. We don't have numbers on that yet. We have some internal demos that we're working to kind of clean up, which show how performant it can be. And we're still doing a lot of optimization work too. But I'm afraid to virtualize the DOM. I'm afraid to abstract the DOM too much, because in real-world application development, you always have to break out of that, and you always have to go touch the real DOM, and then that kind of messes up the constraints of the system a little bit. And I'd much rather just let people work with the technologies that are there, and find ways to kind of be as efficient as possible as we can. Now, about React, because React has a fantastic virtual DOM implementation. There are other virtual DOM implementations out there besides React that make particular rendering scenarios very, very nice. So one thing I want to point out about Aurelia is that React is a little bit different in that it's not as much of a framework as it is a rendering library. And one of the cool things that you can do with Aurelia is you can write a custom element, and you can say, again, this is breaking from conventions, but you put a decorator and you say no view. And what this tells the framework is there's no template for this. We're not going to load a template. We're not going to involve our compiler or anything. This custom element that you're writing is going to be responsible for its own internal rendering. So what you can do then is you can take React, and you can use React or any virtual DOM to, on a per component basis, render that one element. And so we've designed this because we want a very strong, very nice, clean integration story with things like React, where maybe you build 95% of your app in Aurelia, but there's this one component that has some performance issue for whatever reason. But you say, oh, but React is uniquely, it's uniquely designed to handle this scenario really well. So we just make it easy for you to just drop it right in there and use it, and then you're done. And what's really cool too is that we've got this data binding system, and because most things are one-way data binding, it actually works very nicely with React as well. So you can very easily set up an Aurelia custom element that actually is data bindable through the HTML when you use it in an Aurelia view, but that whenever the bindings change, you just trigger a complete re-render internally using React. And so you can kind of get a component that from the outside plugs into the data binding system and is a very seamless, nice way of using it, a very nice developer experience as a reusable component across your app. But internally is using React to do the rendering. So you can kind of get some of the best of both worlds in that. So I wanted to kind of highlight that because while our core system is not built on a virtual DOM, if you have a need for a virtual DOM or you encounter some specific case that doesn't work as well with Aurelia, there's no problem to dropping that in and still having actually a very nice developer experience doing that. Now we hope that won't be the case. We hope that Aurelia will be, we don't really know yet because we haven't done a lot of our intense performance work. We're just starting on that. But we hope that, you really won't have to do that. But we want to keep those options open because each framework or library has strengths and weaknesses. And if we make it easy to, that's just a fact. So if we make it easy to overcome our weaknesses with the strengths of another library, if we make that really, really easy for you to do, then I think that this is really good for developers because they don't have to feel pigeonholed or they don't have to feel like they hit a wall. They don't have to feel like, great, I just spent 6 months building this Aurelia app, but I've got this one screen and I just can't make it perform right. I got to dump everything now. We'd never want anyone to do that. So we're really focused on kind of these points of integration and making that really smooth too.
I think that component level compatibility is kind of the thing that distinguishes the next generation of frameworks versus the old school frameworks, and I think
right.
I think doing that helps everybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's kind of this component barrier, whether it's really enforced by the platform or not. It's there through the way that you use things. And then inside of that barrier, you can do whatever you want, and that just makes everybody happier because I've seen people that got in development with a particular framework and they got X months in and X dollars in, and then they got to a point where they just could not do what they had to do, and it's just a terrifying moment. So you never ever want to have a design that puts people in that situation, and so we think we'll be really fast. It's pretty darn fast already. But I'm not going to tell you that there isn't some specific case that React just happens to do better. Because every framework has strengths and weaknesses, but we want to make it easy for you to plug these pieces together if you have to, and not have to throw everything out. And so that's a key. And we have people doing this actually with Aurelia right now. We have people using Aurelia and React together. There's a blog post. I'll see if I can find a link to it. The guy that's doing that at his company, and he's really, really happy. He's just very happy about the experience because he does the bulk of his work with Aurelia, and he likes how things come together. And then he drops down to React as sort of a, if you will, like a low-level renderer when he has to in specific components, and he loves it. He's been really happy. So
for good or for bad, marketing kind of plays a fairly big role into this front-end framework.
It does.
Do you have any plans for that, or is your plan just kind of build the best framework you can, or what's your marketing strategy going forward?
I can't tell you, but yes, we have plans.
That's fair, right?
I can tell you, I built a lot of open source and front end stuff, and it's been used by a lot of companies, big and small. And but with Aurelia, we're doing something very different, which is that we have created a new company to own it. And we are putting a strong business model behind it. So Aurelia, we're seeing Aurelia as a product of this company.
Very cool.
It's a MIT licensed open source, will always be MIT licensed open source product. But we're treating it like a product, and so we're going to do all the things that a product company were doing if they wanted to sell you a product, right? But hopefully we won't be annoying about it, right? But we also have other products that we're going to release. So we're coming to that side of things. We want to build an entire ecosystem, and Aurelia is the foundation of that. And so we will have other products that are built for Aurelia, other products built with Aurelia that we're dogfooding the framework, and we're making the company and its business model dependent on the success of the open source framework and dependent on customer satisfaction, frankly. So we really want to be personally connected with our customers and meeting their needs, and we want our company to be dependent on the framework being good enough to build real, serious products with. So we're setting ourselves up that from the get-go. And of course, we're planning a bunch of other things, and there'll be marketing around this, but we're planning other open source stuff around this. We're planning other, maybe not initially open source, but free products. Maybe some freemium stuff. We've got some commercial stuff. We'll have commercial support. There are a lot of companies that want to get into this kind of development, but just cannot adopt a library if it doesn't have a commercial support option. It's just, the people on high have dictated no code shall be used unless they can purchase commercial support. So that's not everybody, but it is some people, and so we want to provide that. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff around Aurelia designed to be interesting to all sorts of different people, indie developers, small businesses, enterprises with different constraints and targeting different markets. And so we've got kind of a suite of products, and Aurelia is really is the foundation for all of it, and it's kind of just the beginning. And so we're super excited about that. I can't really give you all those details right now, but I can tell you that there is a significant business model and a significant kind of marketing plan around all of that. Right now, we're leveraging just a lot of grassroots stuff with marketing, and we've seen it's been really fantastic. I mean, it all started with just a blog. I blogged on my personal blog. I mean, I'm pretty well followed, so that helps, and I have some history in this. But that's how we started just a couple months ago, making the announcement, and so far we've just seen a fantastic response from the community. And I know just around my own town here, I've been out kind of talking to people that have brought Aurelia up to me, and there are people that I would not normally have expected to know about this particular library. Maybe they would find out about it a year from now or something. But they knew about it, and they were asking about it, and they were tracking that kind of thing. So we're seeing a pretty good awareness of it already, and a really, as you guys have mentioned, the Gitter room is fantastic, and that's growing like every day. And so we're seeing a lot of really nice, just community movement, and we want to help that grow from that perspective as much as possible. I think that's kind of the best way for it to grow. But we've got a bunch of stuff that we'll be doing for the community, and some traditional marketing stuff, but also just a lot of things to get the community excited. And I think that'll go, I'm positive that'll go really, really far, because we're seeing good feedback already.
I think it's great. I think the project's really cool. I got those links from the Gitter room on React. There's two links that I'll post in the show notes. If there's you brought up the Gitter again, so we should probably just quickly ask some of these. And most of this stuff looks like it was covered already, so it should be pretty quick.
Sure.
Okay, so this is from WebBear1000. Okay, Aurelia deserves more traction, but I stumbled on it completely by accident. What are the plans to bring Aurelia more into the limelight? I think Tyler's question kind of covers that.
Yeah, I think so.
With Google and MS pushing Angular now, it's going to be pretty hard to be noticed. It'd be interesting to know how or even you plan to get noticed. And we know now that you can't tell us.
The thing is, though, too, we are getting noticed, and the quote teaming up is not really what most people think it is. So Microsoft, for example, is very interested in being fairly agnostic. They want to sell you their tools, and they want to sell it to. They're looking at whatever people their developers want to use. As a prime example of this, just a couple of weeks after we announced Aurelia, I'm on an insiders list at Microsoft. This isn't really secret, They're all of a sudden there's all these requests for JSPM support coming to the Visual Studio team, and I know that it had to do with Aurelia because one of our core technologies is JSPM, and we kind of help JSPM a little bit and letting more people know about that. So literally just a number of weeks, all of a sudden, Visual Studio team developers are like, we're hearing a lot of requests for support for JSPM and ECMAScript 6 actually. Like it happened right, just very close.
ECMA 2015.
Yeah. So it happened very close after we made some waves with kind of the initial announcements. And so Microsoft is a company that's very much kind of they're pretty risk averse. And they like to. Everybody knows that follows what they do. Anyways, that's
They're
my
great though.
that's my opinion. So I have a great relationship with them. They're pretty much of the opinion of let's watch what the community does and let's make our tooling support whatever the people want to do. And the partnering with Angular has more a lot to do with TypeScript. The fact that this is a major win for the TypeScript team, who really wanted a big project to be built with TypeScript. So they wanted to market that in order to help validate TypeScript, which I think is very legitimate. And we've been working with the TypeScript team too. They would like us to be written with TypeScript also. And they would probably do some similar blogging if we did that. But we have been telling them that they need to fix a couple more things first before we would consider that. So we've got a great relationship there. I'm not worried about. I'm really not worried about getting noticed at all, to be honest, because it's already happening. And like I said, there will be more things that will turn some heads, I think, as we release more.
Nice. So some other questions. Soul Drinker says, is Aurelia I-18 next? Or I-18, I don't know how you pronounce it, but...
Yeah, the internationalization stuff.
Yeah. Is the way you plan to implement translations in Aurelia, as it sounds, on GitHub? Or is it just some example, as says in the wiki?
Yeah, so this is one of our core team members is working on internationalization. And he's doing it in one of his own repos right now, kind of prototyping and experimenting. And that will be the seed or the foundation for our official internationalization support. So we will have a plugin to do that. Of course, you can use whatever you want, but we would like to have a nice solution as well. And because we have a validation library plugin, it needs internationalization, so those will integrate together. I don't know if we mentioned this before, but Aurelia is very modular. You can use it in a bunch of different ways, but there's a core set of modules you can use as an app framework, and then there's a bunch of optional modules you can just drop in. So if you want HTTP support, you can drop in that, or you could use something else. If you want validation, you can drop in our validation, or use something else. It's completely pluggable, and so we will have an internationalization plugin that you can just drop in and leverage because a lot of people do need that and want that, and so we're kind of in what I would call a research and develop, a research phase, if you will, on that piece.
Okay, last question too. Built-in soft ticks.
Yep.
From the Gitter. Says, elaborate a bit on language support, how ES5, ES6, and TypeScript can be used with Aurelia, and what the future might bring. Decorators, lasers, ninjas, and foo.
Yeah, Buildin's one of our core team members, so I think he primed this with something that he was really excited about. So, and we've kind of talked about this today because we're getting ready to today make an update that has support for decorators, and so that is, I think, it's a very nice addition, a nice way to use the framework, and so that will work. That works, like I said, that works with TypeScript 1.5, which is in alpha right now, and it works with the Babel 5 and above, which they released last week. So that is language support today, and I highly recommend people to use one of those two languages. As TypeScript is moving forward, they're aligning more with the ECMAScript standard, so ultimately they'll just be like ES6, 7 plus types and strong tooling there, and that's, I think, where they want to go. And so I usually tell people to use one of those two because you're going to have the best development experience doing that. You're going to learn standards-based stuff, and you're going to be able to kind of take you're going to be out classes and lambdas and decorators, and you're going to be able to use, kind of the best set of features in a standards-based way by doing it. That said, we're not tied to that in any way, and we have ways of, in place of decorators, we have kind of a fluent API for decorating, classes in ES5. So if you want to make yourself suffer and work entirely in ES5 only, then you can do that, and you can use this alternative API to do all the same stuff we do with decorators against against your ES5 code. You can use require.js with that and AMD, and then you can use these other helpers, and you can totally put that together. And CoffeeScript would be the same way. It'd be a little bit nicer with CoffeeScript because they have class support in the language and things like that, and they have static members and things like this. So, but you can use any language that you want, and we have really thought hard about still trying to make it easier for things like ES5 and like CoffeeScript. So that's not painful when you need to use things like decorators. It's not painful to use that. But you're going to get your best experience with using Babel or TypeScript. And I think most people, when they're seeing it, unless they have some kind of company constraint or some kind of team culture issue, when they're seeing what you can do with TypeScript 1.5 or with Babel in a framework like this, they get really excited because it's almost like a different platform. And so we're trying to encourage people in that direction. That's going to have the most bells and whistles and be the nicest experience. But we're also keeping in mind other languages as well, and making sure that things work as painlessly as possible there.
That's fantastic. Well, we're a little bit over our time right now. Rob, tell everybody how they can get in touch with you, find you on Twitter, GitHub.
And you also contribute to Aurelia.
Yeah, so I'm easy to find. Eisenberg Effect on Twitter, GitHub, and pretty much everywhere where I hang out. Aurelia.io is the official website. You can go on gitter.im Aurelia discuss, and that's our public discussion group. Great place to ask questions. And if you want to get involved, actually I just tell people, like, start with the website, read what's there, get in the Gitter room, ask questions, don't be afraid. You know, sometimes people are afraid, like, oh, this is a dumb question, I don't want to sound dumb or whatever, but you know, this is sort of a brave new world. There's a lot of happening. We want to make it a very welcoming community, whether you're, you know, an expert guy that could build Aurelia, or whether you're the guy that has only done like C++ code and like you're like down with this web thing, and you know, you want to figure that out. So it doesn't matter. Get in there, ask questions, then start like exploring the code base, because it's a fun, it's like a great way to just like learn about ES6, and like it's all open source. So like you want to find out like how does the templating engine work? It's like it's very modular. You know, so this actually makes it easy to learn. You want to learn how dependency injection works? Go look at the dependency injection library. It's like a couple hundred lines of JavaScript. Just go start there and look at the unit tests and look at the code and just learn it. And then like submit a pull request. You know, add a unit test that's missing or whatever. Look at some of the open issues, and you know, we're very open. I really am excited about community contribution, and we've got a core team that's working on it daily. Not 12 developers. But we've got a lot of people from the community that are just regularly contributing fantastic work. So if that excites you, if you want to be part of something like that, we are just very excited to have you. And those are the kind of the places to look and read and check out, and hopefully have fun. We're having a good time. I'm really excited about, you know, what kind of the future of the web holds with what we're building.
No, that's fantastic. All right, Rob, thank you very, very much again for coming on. That's and Nick or Tyler, you got any last minute things you want to throw on top?
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
No problem at all. Thank you very, very much.